Week 2 of The Plague, La Peste by Albert Camus. Hopefully you have gotten to the point you need to be in the text. Once again, this is one of those where I would say I hope you enjoy it, but enjoy takes on a little bit different valence here. You don't enjoy this the way you would an action film or something that you watch just for fun, right? You have to sink into it in a little bit different way. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the question of time. That's a very, very broad and very complicated question, but I think you'll understand why in a little bit. If you've read enough of The Plague to be where you need to be this week, you might notice it doesn't move the way you think it might. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, but the first time I read the book, I was expecting something that I didn't get, and so I ended up putting it down after a while because it felt really slow. If it's the same way for you, I hope this lecture will help you understand a little bit better a way to approach that. So let's get to it. I'm calling this the weird world of narrative time. I'm slightly influenced by an audiobook lecture I'm listening to on Einstein and the theory of relativity. All right. The French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, who is possibly my favorite philosopher, favorite critical thinker. He's fascinating. I would talk about more why, except I figure you'd all be incredibly bored if I did. But he wrote 4 full books on the question of how we as human beings experience time, always in a narrative fashion. The first volume of this series is called On Metaphor. It's an entire book. Wait for it. On metaphor. I know that probably sounds like the most boring thing you can possibly imagine. I don't know. I found it fascinating, partially because we never really think about what a metaphor is or what it does. Anyway, he bases the study of all 4 books on the following perplexing philosophical problem. Do we project a sense of time for ourselves, or do we experience the flow of time as something outside of us? Do we make it or experience it? It's a classic problem in philosophy, right? Because if it's something outside of us, how do we know our measurements are accurate? And if we make it up ourselves, who cares, right? It doesn't have any meaning. Now, he essentially says that fictional narrative, it's not a way of answering the question or synthesizing it, as putting him into dynamic relationship, which is sort of a fancy way of saying it bridges the gap between the two. And either, depending on how you want to put it, he either creates his own third space with this idea, or just kind of moves back and forth between the two. So no fictional narrative can arise from a vacuum, right? You have to have some idea of what time is in order for narrative to work. But narrative does things that our ordinary experience of time every day simply doesn't or can't. Now, the core of fictional narrative for Ricoeur is plot, which he defines using Aristotle's formulation as an imitation of action. So all fictional implotment is a way of emulating action in the real world, and this occurs in 3 stages for him. Mimesis, meaning imitation, 1, is the realm of prefiguration. This is basically before the narrative, quote unquote, really starts, right? But just going through your life every day means recognizing that certain things are more than just random physical motions in space. Ricoeur even takes it on down to closing a door. Someone walks out of a room, closes the door. What do you assume? You don't assume that something random has happened. You assume that the person left the room for a reason, closed the door for a reason, and are going where they're going for a reason, right? And that reason, that series of events that is thought out ahead of time with a recognizable goal at the end, is a form of narrative, right? And this is the ground that grows the seed of a narrative. Now, mimesis 2 is figuration. This is where you get an actual plot. An actual author crafts an actual plot out of all the things that happen every day that we recognize as even the most primitive, basic forms of narrative. Now, mimesis, too, is incredibly complex. I've boiled it down to 2 sentences, which is kind of silly, but, we're not in a philosophy class, and we're just going to use this in a minute. Mimesis 3 is reading, right? This is where the reader takes what an author has, quote-unquote, figured and does 2 things with it. First, the reader finishes the process of composition and essentially allows that work to be called a narrative. In other words, it's like if the receiver of a message, when they receive and grasp it, at that point you have communication. If I just say something out into the air and no one hears it, when it gets down to that sort of if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around, etc. But in this case, there has to be a sender and a receiver, an author and a reader, to have narrative or fictional narrative. And second, the reader, as Ricoeur puts it, plays with the narrative constraints, brings about gaps, and enjoys the pleasure that Roland Barthes called the pleasure of the text. In other words, no matter what an author intends in the words, the reader's always going to do different things with them. That's the beauty of fictional narrative. And this is also why, as we talked last time, trying to say exactly what an author meant not only is impossible, but it's kind of beside the point, right? This text is yours when you get it. It's meant to be played with. It's meant to be enjoyed. And any good author will have crafted the narrative in such a way that you can't just completely go off the rails. There's always boundaries you're not going to cross, but within those boundaries, many, many things are possible. Now, Ricoeur insists that these 3 stages run in a dynamic circle. So people every day experience their lives in a narrative way. The author takes that store of experiences and turns it into a plot. The reader reads the text, does what they want with the plot, and in playing with it, adds back to the general understanding of what narrative is. Right? So your awareness that a narrative is happening. I am listening to a story, reading a story. That simple awareness comes from a sort of a general cultural understanding of what that kind of thing is. Other cultures have different ideas, and this is why many times stories don't translate well across cultures, because someone can be doing something and another culture will go, what is that exactly? A lot of avant-garde and experimental writing does that. It's just not recognizable as narrative even. Now, this also means that when a fictional narrative contains a few different kinds of temporal experiences. I don't know why I put when in there, whatever. Time is short. We can't go back and edit every word of every PowerPoint. Anyway, first, there's time as it's constructed within the plot, right? So that's merely the language itself. Now, this is a lot more dramatic in French, where there's an entire verb tense called the pluperfect, which is an entirely literary tense. You cannot use it in everyday speech. They don't really use it, frankly, all that much anymore. If you do, it makes you sound... It'd be like writing in English and saying thee and thou now. You mean, technically you could do it, but it's weird. Anyway, the fact that there's a tense at all is pretty impressive. But even not, there's ways of cueing people into the idea that time is passing in a text, and that's time as it's experienced by characters in the fictional world, right? And by fictional world, it can be films too, right? As you watch it, something happens to somebody on the screen, and 20 years have passed for that person, right? But only for that character in that fictional world. Now, second, there's our experience of that time. Now, this, of course, includes both that sense of being there that makes fiction so fascinating, and also the not being there that we get from the feel of our chair or the ringing of a doorbell or all the other things that remind us of the passage of time in our world. That seems kind of silly, maybe, but it's important because a narrative is crafted in such a way that it's meant to be experienced more than just mentally. And you've had this experience. It's why sometimes it's way more fun to read if you have, I don't know, a really good cup of coffee. Or my favorite is when it's pouring rain outside and I have a hot drink and I'm just sitting and reading. That's fantastic, right? Or when I was preparing for my doctoral exams several years ago and we were back visiting family in France, and I used to do my reading next to this creek that was running through a little forest. This is way out in the countryside near Belgium. And I used to just sit on this bench by a little creek and read. I mean, come on, it was amazing, right? My actual experience of the narrative in the story was affected by that. Third, and for my money, this is the most interesting one. There's a sense of an ending, which means we always read front to back, but also back to front, right? All of us have watched enough films and read enough books to have this sense of, I see where this is going. You can't get away from that unless you only watch like one film every 10 years or something. Certain what we call genre fiction items tend to suffer from that, right? So if you watch a science fiction film, I say 2001: A Space Odyssey, the first time anyone watches that, I think, it drives them crazy because you're used to science fiction being exciting, fun. There's a certain expectations for how it's going to go, and then it just gets weird, and where are we going? And then it's extremely disappointing. That's because we are trained by certain genres of writing and certain kinds of entertainment to expect certain things. We know it's going to be resolved. Even if we don't like the resolution, we know that something is going to resolve what we're reading. And that expectation means we're always trying to figure out a little bit ahead of the action what's going to happen next. You know, if you're watching a detective film, you're always thinking to yourself, okay, so I'll bet that person ends up being da-da-da. In this day and age, whenever I watch a murder mystery or something now, I always expect, I always locate the character who looks like the absolute last possible choice for the killer. I go, that's got to be them, because all movies these days end that way. It's never someone normal or ordinary, right? So that's that sense of an ending. You're experiencing the narrative sequentially, moving forward, but you're always reading backwards as well from this sense of an expectation of how it's going to end. I mentioned at the beginning that the first time I read The Plague, I had to put it down. I wasn't ready for it. This is due to something I like to call the Godfather effect. The Godfather being the film, The Godfather. Well, it was based on a novel, but by now there's so many movies based on mafia stories, telling gang narratives, right? And they always go a certain way. They're almost always very exciting, very graphic, very whatever. The first time you watch The Godfather, or for me anyway, I thought, why is this so great? Because I'd already seen so many films that were like that. It took me a while to figure out something that was different in The Godfather, and The Plague is the same way. Now, by now we have tons of films detailing outbreaks of disease. Some of them are relatively realistic. When I was younger, I remember the film Outbreak with Dustin Hoffman and Renee Russo. Not that you care, but anyway. But basically, most zombie movies are this way. It's always a disease that wipes everybody out, right? Very common. And so you're expecting a much faster narrative. Camus' narrative is not fast. It's very, very slow. And eventually it sort of settles into a groove where you keep waiting for, the biology lab to suddenly have a breakthrough or some dramatic thing to happen, and it doesn't ever seem to happen. You keep that sense of an ending, right? Some big thing is going to happen. There's going to be a hero. There's going to be a scientific breakthrough, something, right? But in the first place, this is not an unknown disease. This is not some brand new Ebola-style thing. It's ancient, very old, right? So it's not like they have to struggle desperately to find some sort of treatment. There already is a treatment. It's just they don't have it, right? Which lends an extra level of futility to the events. But you're also expecting something that's not happening, and it can be frustrating. You sort of have to reprogram how you read. This is important, I would argue, for understanding why the novel is so valuable, especially to where we are right now. Now, this sense of an ending for Ricoeur, which is a little problematic in The Plague, is cast iron. You can't not have it. Even really experimental works that just seem to drop you off a bridge and never lead you anywhere, the only reason they're able to make you feel so strange and mess with you is because they're working with an age-old assumption, right? They can't just dispense with it. It's always there, right? Because remember, in that first stage of mimesis, prefiguration, we're already aware that something called a narrative is going on. So there's a cultural understanding of what that is, and you can't just erase that. So where does that put us? Now, Camus' writing is stripped down and economic, I put here. It feels almost like, well, a little bit like the way it is, a journalist writing the events down. There's a little bit of personal commentating, opining, I guess. But for the most part, the narrator is limiting himself to the events at hand. Sometimes that's frustrating. We'd love to see inside the mind of someone, searching for a solution, right? But we don't get it. We just get the events as they appear. And there's an almost total absence of real drama. I mean, obviously, as the disease builds up, we feel the drama, but it's not presented to us in a dramatic way. But there's more at work here. If you haven't noticed it already, hopefully you will soon, but as the novel progresses, the time of hours, days, and weeks becomes less important than the progression of the disease itself. There's a point, I would say, in the first about 20%, 30% of the novel where we're still cued into phrases like, and then, 2 days later, on the way to the prefect's office. Like, we just see it happening quicker and quicker, and eventually that sort of seems to get monotonous or samey, right? And then the more important stuff is, how many more dead? How long until there's a cure? How many more dead? Just those two questions over and over. Time just flattens into nothing, right? So what happens over the course of several days no longer matters. That days are passing at all doesn't matter. Normal time no longer matters. Now, undoubtedly, you are seeing some parallels to our current experience. It's where we're living in, right? The passage of time is happening. Our semester is moving on. Time is passing. Days are passing. Weeks are passing. But the only thing that seems to define that passage of time is not day and night, 10 a.m., 5 p.m., but statistics, news. How much closer are we to being able to end this, right? How are we going to be able to get back to where we were? Or possibly even more importantly, are we going to get back to where we were? That's the implicit question in the plague as well. Now, ultimately then, that's the central question. This is why it's important to take a step back once in a while when reading the plague, because as much as the novel is about an outbreak of disease, it's actually dealing with all the stuff that happens in the spaces, right? Not just the disease and the patients. You'll notice that although there are diseases and patients, the focus is really on a handful of characters making their way through this. And it's usually not very exciting. It's not like they're running through the streets or desperately trying to call loved ones. They're sort of just slogging through, which you've got to identify with. I know I do. This idea of slogging through and just hoping it'll kind of be over soon, right? Camus once famously remarked, "What is the plague? It's just life." It sounds like a very boring thing to say, but what he meant was all the stuff, this slogging that the people are going through and the sacrifices that requires, it's not unique. Camus is an atheist, so for him, there's no noble end to the human story. There's just an end. That's it. Things just stop. Well, what do you do in the face of that? Right. So in the novel itself, the characters are faced with a society that is effectively broken down. And they have a choice. They can either just effectively kill themselves, which is the option taken by some people in this city, or just sort of push through, power through. But power through for what reason? There's a section, and I can't remember the page number, where someone is confronting Dr. Ricoeur about, why do you keep doing this? There's not much, it's not like you can find a cure for this disease. Why do you keep treating people and doing this? And instead of saying something like, because my love for humanity runs deep, et cetera, it's basically like, well, what else am I going to do? I'm a doctor. I don't know what else to do. And I find that answer beautiful and interesting because it's the most common answer. Most of us would like to give a more noble answer, but why do you do what you do? Well, because what else am I going to do? Flee to the coast? It's not really an option, so I just do what I do, right? And that's one of the core struggles in the book and for those of us reading the book. And not to make the sort of core question too deep, confusing, I don't know. But this is ultimately the question faced by anyone experiencing times as dramatic and strange as these, is what does our life mean outside of them? What does normal life look like? Why do we do what we do? It's the reason Camus says the plague is just life. Like, you think that this is an unusual circumstance, but what does that make the rest of life, right? Now, Camus is an atheist. I am not, so I have my own answers to that question. But it's one of the core problems with any kind of narrative dealing with everyday life, that sense of an ending. What's the ending to this story? If there isn't one, or if it's random, or it doesn't matter, how does that structure not only what we do every day, but our awareness of time passing? I'm 41. I remember distinctly being not 41 and much younger, and my awareness of time as it was passing was very different. Like, who cares that time is passing? I'm 30. Who cares, right? Changes a little bit when you get into your 40s. But the question doesn't. Now, of course, that does not necessarily need to play into your writing, your individual responses, your group responses, but it's worth reflecting on as you read, because it is arguably the central question to the narrative.